about a month ago, I opened up this sermon series, and we started examining sort of what God is up to in the Bible, what God is up to in our lives, and what God has been up to in the world from the beginning of human history. And we're calling this sermon series God's Grand Story. And the whole point of looking at this story is kind of to give us an orientation towards the Bible and an orientation towards Christianity and Christian community, that this is really an invitation into a story. And if you were there for the first week, I mentioned something about stories. I said the stories are informational, they're formational, and they're transformational. So a story that we have in our lives, or a story that we encounter, whether it be from history or from the Bible or religion or from our own families, a story really helps inform sort of what we know about the world. It then forms ideas in us, ideas, biases, good or bad, that we carry with us through the rest of our lives. It also sets us up with things like virtues and morals and ideals and hopes and dreams. That's what stories do in our lives as we hear them and as we step into them. And then finally, stories are transformative in that sometimes we hear a new story or we engage in a story or we encounter a story that we never knew before. And we're drawn into it, and it changes the way that we look at the world and that the world looks to us. And if you were here over the last couple weeks, I spoke about creation several weeks ago. Boris talked about the lifeboat, right? The story of Noah. And what we start to see is this character of God interacting with people throughout human history. From creation, before there was any people, before there were any living beings, to the first people, Adam and Eve in the garden. Remember, they exchanged their fig leaves for animal clothes at God's direction. And then God preserves life through Noah. He sets aside all of the living beings, and he calls this man to care for and to preserve life on this lifeboat. And then Peter came and spoke to us about a blessing that God gave. And it echoes the blessing that God gave in creation, right? To be fruitful and to multiply, to go out and to bless the nations and the world. And it's a blessing that's given to Abraham. And I've been tasked this week with doing the impossible. I'm covering the span of the Bible from Noah to the very end of Genesis. So what we're going to try to do is cover about 40 chapters of text from the Bible, and we're also going to try to make that somehow meaningful and pull us into the story of God and give us something to take away. So what's going to happen is I'm going to talk very fast, and I'm going to present this stuff as if it's a road trip. And the reason I set it up as a road trip is because I was gone for 2 weeks, and I was gone for 2 weeks on a road trip. I was just road tripping across the U.S. Has anyone ever been on a road trip before? So, okay, yeah. Where have you been? Seattle. That's like a day trip, Julia. Come on. California. Okay, that takes a couple days usually. What's the longest anybody's ever driven? Minnesota? Minneapolis? What else? Alaska. Wow. Okay, yeah. So those are all pretty long road trips. What happens on a road trip? Well, the car gets really sweaty. You get tired of the people that you're with. You get really excited about certain things. You get to know the people you're with way better. You have a lot of fun. You have a lot of boredom. Like for us, we drove through Wyoming. Man, is anybody from Wyoming? Well, God bless you if you are, because it's the most boring state in the union. There's just like wheat field upon wheat field. It's like, man, do people even live here? But yeah, there's boredom, there's highs, there's lows, there's beauty, and there's struggle. And what I noticed when I got back from my road trip is I can look back on that story and I can go, man, that story was great. That was really good. That may have been one of the best weeks of my life. And I can pull out reasons for why it was and what was gained from it. Built better relationship, met up with friends, saw some beauty in the world that I didn't see before, changed my perspective. As I go on this journey that opens me up to all of these different experiences, whether good or bad, hard or easy, there's something that we learn along the journey. When I was a junior in college, I went on a trip to South Africa. And I went with 3 professors and 17 of my peers, and we tripped around the entire country of South Africa, staying with people from all different types of racial and ethnic backgrounds, and staying in upper and lower class housing, and staying in cities, and staying in the country, and on ostrich farms, and it was an amazing trip. We gained a lot of perspective. But when we came back, my professor, my speech comm professor, gave me some of the best advice I'd ever heard. He said, Jack, this story has changed your life. This trip that you've been on has impacted you in a way that will transform everything you see for the rest of your life. And I said, yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty true. He said, but you're not going to be able to share that with everybody. Let me give you an example. When you come back to campus, you're going to be walking down the Hello Walk with your backpack on, walking around, and people will say, oh, hey, Jack, hey, you were just in Africa. Yeah, I was. How was it? Oh, it was great. Okay, hey, see ya. No chance to tell the story. Run into somebody in the coffee shop. Jack? Cassie, hey. Oh, Jack, weren't you just in Africa? Oh, come here. Oh, yeah, I was. I was actually in Africa for a whole month. It was crazy. I mean, we did a lot of really great and amazing stuff. Really? Tell me about it. Like, what were some of the highlights? Well, I just learned so much about racial and ethnic backgrounds and diversity and interracial communication, and I learned a lot about the history of apartheid, and I learned this and that and this and that. Oh, great. That's awesome. I was in Europe, and we just saw a museum, and man, all of the art and architecture, it just informed me about the stuff I never knew before. Oh, that's my coffee. Hey, we should catch up soon. All right, sure, Cassie, whatever. You don't really get into the story. But as we tell the story, we learn something more about ourselves, and it deepens sort of that value that I held. Yeah, there was something I really learned that was really valuable. And I get home to my room. Weston! Jack, what's going on, man? Hey, hug. Oh, Weston, it's so good to see you. He's like a short guy, right? It's so good to see you, man. How you been? How was January? Oh, it was great, man. You got to tell me. Hey, come here. Sit down. You got to tell me all about South Africa. Well, it was great. I learned about racial justice, blah, 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 blah. Hey, man, wait, slow down. Slow down. You got time? Like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here all night. Like, just tell me, like, what happened? What was the crazy stuff? And then I get to divulge every detail of the story as we're sitting there. And I can pick apart the details, and I can analyze it. And you know what? I think this is a lot like what our Christian experience is like. A lot of us either become Christians, or if you step into this room and you're not a Christian, or if you don't even know about God and you're on the sidelines and you're just kind of in here listening, trying to gain some perspective, I think a lot of the times we're like the people on the Hello Walk. God bless you. Yeah, great. What does that mean? And then you get into a group with some people, or you start reading the Bible a little bit, or you hear a couple sermons. It's like, yeah, Jesus was God and God was Jesus, and I kind of get that, and somehow it plays a part in my life, and there's sin, and I'm like over it, and somehow, I don't know. And then, hopefully over time, as we're drawn into the story, as we hear more of the Scripture, as we read more of the Bible, as we're around other Christians, as we're in a community, that story starts to put on flesh. It starts to really mean something in our lives. It starts to sink deep into our hearts. And we learn not only about who we are and what our place is in the universe, which is something I think that we're all sort of after, right? But we also learn something about the character of this God that the Bible portrays. And one of the best ways to get to know somebody's character is by spending some time on the road with them. And what I want to present is the road trip that God takes with humanity. And I want to view it from the perspective that the main character of the story isn't Abraham, it's not Isaac, it's not Jacob, it's not Joseph, it's actually God. What can we learn about the trip that God takes with humanity? Are you ready? Here's God getting back from his road trip. Oh, man. Dad? Jesus? Oh, my goodness. Oh, son, it's so good to see you. Dad, I missed you. How was your trip? Where did you go? What was it like? Come in. Sit down. Actually, you know what? Take care of whatever you need to take care of. I'll be here waiting for you. Jesus, no, it's fine. I'm good. Let's talk. God, tell me how your trip was. Take a seat. What was it like? Where did you go? Who did you meet? Tell me everything. Tell me the details. Well, son, I'd love to tell you all the details, but don't you have to go to work pretty soon? I don't know. I think I've got about 3,000 years, so we should be pretty good. Oh, okay, great. That should be just enough time. Hopefully I can get through it in the next 3,000 years or so. Human translation, 30 minutes. Here we go. All right. Jesus, I made a slideshow for you because these people put together a book called the Bible. No way, they wrote a book about your travels? That's pretty cool. Yeah, I know. I thought it was neat, too. So I thought I'd just pick and choose some stuff, and we could go through it. Oh, all right, great. So tell me everything. I want really like the details of what happened with these people because, I'm going to be working for them and with them, and I just want to know what I'm kind of getting myself into. Sure thing, Jesus. Here we go. So first of all, there was this guy named Abraham. And Abraham came after Noah. And Noah was, he had 3 sons, right? There was that Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Well, Ham, he gave birth to all the Canaanites. He's the one who saw Noah naked, right? Nasty, man. Yeah, I know. So he saw Noah naked. He became the Canaanites. Shem, his line of lineage actually gave birth to Abram. No way. Abram, that means like good father, right? Yeah, he's like an exalted father. So Abram goes off into the east, and he goes out to Egypt, to the south, rather, to Egypt. And he meets this woman, and she's beautiful. First slide. Oh, skip that. Skip that too. Skip that. Okay, so we get out into the wilderness, and we're with Abram. And this guy was great. He was old, but he was down for anything. He was excited to go on this trip with me. And I knew that he would be open to it because of the way he responded. I came to him and I said, hey, Abram, I'm going to make you a great nation. He just said, okay, great, let's do that. So he headed out to Egypt. And while he was in Egypt, he met a woman. He married this woman named Sarah, and she was beautiful. But he said, hey, let's pretend that you're my sister so that they don't kill me and try to take you because you're so beautiful. And I was kind of in the back seat, like, I don't know, that's not the best idea, but we'll see what happens. So Pharaoh takes her as a wife. I had to bail them out of that situation. And then Abraham goes on, and he ends up settling in this land called Canaan, which is sort of the area that most of his cousins from Ham sort of settled. And he kind of starts living in Canaan by the Oaks of Mamre, which I was like, yeah, that's great. That's where you should probably stay. It's out of the desert. And then he had a nephew, Lot. Lot and him kind of started to butt heads, and if we go on to the next slide here, they started to butt heads, and there were military skirmishes going on, and he was with his nephew. And so I showed up to kind of mediate and give him some bread and wine as the high priest, Melchizedek, and I said, hey, blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. I just kind of wanted to comfort Abram's spirits because he's getting a little restless out here in the desert, and he and Lot are kind of starting to fight. So I show up, and I give him this blessing. And then Abram's like, this is great, but I'm getting kind of old. How am I ever going to continue my lineage? You mean he didn't have any sons like me? That's right, Jesus, no sons. So I appear to him, and I say, you know what? You're going to be a great nation. Just don't worry about it. Sarah, on the other hand, says, look, I'm barren. I can't have any kids. You can have Hagar, my maidservant. So Hagar goes into Abram, and they have a bunch of kids. And at first, she has one son named Ishmael. Ishmael, like, call me Ishmael, like Herman Melville's Moby Dick? Exactly, Jesus. You know all the human stuff so well. So Ishmael is born to Hagar. And then there's a number of other kids that come out of this, but Sarah is super jealous about her own action, where she said, go into Hagar, and so it's like, okay, well, what the heck? What am I supposed to do? Abram says, and he says, well, okay, get out of here, Hagar. And then I appeared to Hagar in an angel, and I said, hey, Hagar, where are you going, and where have you been? And she says, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah. She's been really mean to me. And I said, well, that's okay. You'll be a great nation as well. Like, I'll increase Ishmael's offspring. Just go back, stay in the land of Canaan, be with Abraham. Everything will be good. She says, great. Things go on, and Abraham starts to develop some military prowess, and he's kind of starting to buy in a little bit more. And I say, you know what, Abram? You're not just going to be a great father. You're going to be a great father of many, many nations. Now that you've got Ishmael, and now that you're kind of conquering all of these lands, I'm going to change your name from Abram to Abraham. I'm going to call you the great father of people, not just great father sort of generally, because you're going to be the great father of all of these nations in the Middle East, of everybody. You're going to be the one whose bounty increases 1,000-fold. You're the be fruitful and multiply. And he says, okay, great. What do we do? And he says, circumcise. What? Why do you want to circumcise yourself? And he goes, well, there's Canaanites around here. They're not circumcised. We should probably be circumcised. They wanted to circumcise themselves? Yeah, I know. It's just kind of what they went with. But it set them apart from the Canaanites, right? So I said, okay, go for it. And he circumcises himself and all of his people at age 90. And I was like, this dude is in. I'm going to give him a kid. So I go to him and I say, hey, let's do this. I know Sarah is barren, but let's open the womb. I'm going to give you a son. His name will be Isaac. And you remember you were there. Oh, right, yeah, you, me, and HS. We went down there and we were at the Oaks of Mamre. Yeah, the Holy Spirit was there as well. There were 3 people. Yeah, so we show up at the Oaks of Mamre and we say, hey, we're going to give you a child. And Sarah starts laughing. I say, you think that's funny? You think it's funny you're going to have a kid? And she says, I think it's ridiculous. I'm barren and old, and so is Abraham. And I said, you shall name him He Laughs. And so they do. His name is Isaac, which means he laughs. And Isaac is born, and things are going well. There's circumcision and all of this stuff. And then there's problems with Sodom and Gomorrah. I go to check it out. I decide that it's pretty bad. But Abram's like, hey, look, God, you don't want to destroy these people. Look at the flood. I mean, you preserved Noah. You preserved all these people. Your call has been to preserve people throughout all of history. Why would you go and wipe out whole cities? And I go, oh, that's a pretty good point. I guess I've been on the road with you enough that I'm kind of losing my mind a little bit in this tight little car. We should probably discuss this. If there are some righteous people in Sodom, I'll let them off the hook. What if there's 45 or 30 or 20? Yeah, okay. If there are righteous people, sure. Then Abraham says, well, what if there's just 10? Turns out I only found Lot, so Sodom's gone. There was one righteous person. Lot had some kids. Those kids were Moab and also his son Benami, which means son of nations. He became the Amorite tribe. So now we have like 4 tribes going on. There's Lot's sons. They're over in the west. They lived in the Jordan. I'm out here in Canaan with Abraham. He has 2 sons. There's Ishmael and there's Isaac. And we're starting to set the stage for what's going to be some really great nations coming up here. And they're all related, right? They're all working together. Ham is sort of like distant cousins with Abram, and his sons all live in Canaan, but Abram's a Hebrew, and he's living there as well. So we've got the stage set for some pretty good stuff coming up, despite all of our traveling around and Abraham kind of being all wonky with the wives and, not really trusting me in his old age and everything, and the military conflicts. And then there's a famine, and he goes up to talk to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. And if you know anything, Jesus, you know the Philistines were a problem. Yeah, judges, Samson, long hair, all of that. Yeah, right. So the Philistines become a problem later, but they were a problem from the beginning. Abraham goes up and he talks with them. There's some fighting. And I say, don't worry about it. Stay in Canaan. That's where your blessing remains. And it will happen through Isaac. Well, while this famine is happening, Abraham stays in Canaan. The other nations are growing in strength and vitality. And then Sarah dies. And Abraham says, you know what? I'm going to go to this Eniorite guy, and I'm going to purchase this cave in Machpelah. And so he does. The guy kind of shakes him down and doesn't give him the best deal. And Abraham ends up with this nice cave to bury all of his family members. And it's in Canaan, which is great. It's the promised land. So he buries Sarah, and then he takes his son, and he's kind of been around the Philistines. He was up here for a while traveling around this area, and we heard all of these different stories about what gods are like. And Abraham takes his son up to the mountain, and he decides, I'm going to sacrifice Isaac to show this God that I'm really in. As if I needed any proof, the dude circumcised himself at 90 and gave himself a wife and all of this stuff for me. Of course he's in. But he takes his son up to the mountain, and he offers to sacrifice him. And I send an angel, and I say, whoa, Abraham, don't do this. I know that you're in. You've got your firstborn son here. You've given me your entire life and all of your blessing, and my blessing is with you, and it's with your son Isaac. And then suddenly Abraham sees a ram, and he goes, oh, God has provided. I'm not going to sacrifice my son. I'm going to sacrifice this ram. Isaac leaves the mountain, and he's very confused about how to feel about his dad. So we take it from there. Abraham says, look, I'm getting kind of old. Isaac's now at a place where he's getting kind of mature. Feels sort of bad about the human sacrifice thing I tried to do to him. I'm going to get him a nice wife. But I'm going to get him a wife from another area so that we can kind of spread out. He says, Father of many nations, it's a good idea. Let's do it. So he goes and he sends a servant. And he says, when you see a girl that's of marriageable age, that's very attractive, bring her back for Isaac. And the servant says, what? The servant says, okay, I'm going to pray to God. So here's what I said. I didn't want to be sitting out there in the desert with him all the time. So I'm like, the next girl who comes to the well and pours you a drink for you and your camels, that's the girl to marry. Sure enough, I made that the next girl that he sees. So this girl comes out. She's very beautiful. She's filling up her water. The servant says, oh my goodness, maybe this is what God was trying to tell me. He says, can you give me some water? She says, not only will I give you water, I'll give your camels water. Turns out Rebekah has a brother, Laban. Laban is a great guy. And he sees this happening with his sister, and he says, look, we want to join forces with you Canaanites. And they go, we're not Canaanites, we're Hebrews. And he says, oh, we want to join forces with whatever God you're with. And he says, I'm with the God of Abram, the God who said, I will make you a great nation. And Laban goes, oh, well, that's really interesting. Rebekah, why don't you go off with them and make a great nation? That would be good for both of us. So she does. And it's kind of this classic servant finds boy, or servant finds girl, girl meets boy, boy's in field, girl sees boy, instantly falls in love and gets over his mother's death. That's what happened with Isaac, right? So he gets over his mother's death, and they go on. And then there's about 50 years where Abraham's kind of trying to split up his estate. He dies. Isaac's eyesight goes bad. And while Isaac's getting older, surprise, surprise, Rebekah is barren, just like Sarah. So they start praying, and I'm like, okay, look, you're blind. We've been on this road trip a long time. Let's just take a break. Let's just sit here, Isaac. You're the son of favor. You know it's all good. I know your dad confused you with the human sacrifice thing, but I got you, buddy. We'll be okay. So I opened up Rebekah's womb, and she gave birth to a son. And surprise, it was 2 sons, twins. And she's like, this is more than what I prayed for. What's happening? And I said, there are 2 nations in your womb. 2 are going to come forth from you, and they're going to be great. And they're going to be at odds a little bit in their life, but eventually the older one will serve the younger one. Sure enough, the older one comes out. He's all hairy and chiseled and buff. Like, birthing was very different back then, ladies, trust me. But he comes out, and he's this big guy, and then there's this little heel grabber, which is literally what Jacob means. He grabs the heel, which is like a Hebrew idiom that I like to use because I think it's funny and the English people don't get it. That's great. I love that. Heel grabber. What does that even mean? Yeah, it means he's a trickster. Anyway, Jacob comes out, and I love what it says. I love how they decide to describe Esau and Jacob. They say, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. He was kind of a more sensitive kid, played video games, and he was really smart, but not really into sports. Right? So Esau's more into sports, and the way to a man's stomach is what? Or the way to a man's heart is what? Through his stomach, right? So Jacob, of course, loves Esau, and he's like, yeah, football, and it was probably more like, yeah, gladiator smash and smash ball, or whatever they played back then, and hunting and food. And so he brings in food to Jacob, or to Isaac, and Isaac loves that. But Jacob can't really do anything to win his father's approval. Doesn't that sound kind of like what Abram was trying to do? Sacrificing his son, win his father's approval, win God's approval. And then Isaac tries to do it, right, by making a great nation, but he can't because he's blind, he's not a good warrior, and he can't produce children. It's always trying to win that favor. And I say, listen, Jacob, there is blessing for you. There is blessing here. I pronounced it to Rebekah while you were in the womb. You are the son of favor. Nevertheless, Jacob doesn't hear that message from me. He just hears what his father tells him, which is basically, stop being a sissy and get outside like your brother. Well, Jacob stays inside, and Rebekah really likes Jacob because he does his laundry and he stays pretty clean. So eventually there end up being these squabbles, and Jacob makes the food that Esau brings in, and Esau's tired from hunting one day, and he comes in, and he sits down, and he goes, brother, give me some stew. I'm going to die. And he says, tell you what, I'll give you some stew if you give me your birthright. Who would sell their birthright for stew? Well, you don't understand. Esau was thinking temporally. He's like, I'm going to die if I don't get some food. I don't care about my birthright. So he sells his birthright to Jacob. Jacob steals his birthright. Later on, he steals his blessing. So as Isaac's getting a little bit older, remember his eyesight's not so good. He's already kind of gullible anyway. He he's about to give his blessing. He's thinking about continuing on the estate, and he's like, these boys are getting too old to live at home. They need to go get married. They need to go have a nation of their own, right? So I'm going to give off my, deathbed blessings. Well, Rebekah hears this is happening, and Esau's out hunting. And she says, quick, put on your brother's clothes and cologne and stuff, and go in and talk to your father. And so he does, and he's like, you smell like meat. You're my son. But you sound like Jacob, but you're hairy. I'll kiss you and give you a blessing. So he does. And then Esau comes in, and he's like, Dad, my blessing. And he's like, I just gave it to your brother. You're going to get the worst blessing. I'll give you I already gave out the good one. What am I supposed to do? So Jacob gets the good blessing. Well, Esau gets pretty upset about this and starts stewing. And Isaac's like, you know what? I need to get my boys apart, otherwise they're going to rip each other apart, and I already gave the good blessing to Jacob. Jacob, be a good boy and go marry a girl. And marry a girl from Rebekah's tribe, because Rebekah was awesome. And don't marry any of the girls around here, because I don't like them. Because they're the people that do human sacrifice, and it almost killed me. And so Jacob goes, okay, I'll go marry somebody from Rebekah's tribe. So he goes down to Paran-Aram, and while he's there, he meets his uncle. He's like, oh, the blessing boy, bring me blessings. And so Jacob shows up with his blessings and says, hey, what can I do? I really want to marry your daughters. I like Rachel. She is smoking hot. And so he sees Rachel, and he goes, well, I don't know. What about Leah? And he's like, Leah has weak eyes, which is like the worst thing you can say in Hebrew. He said she had weak eyes? What a jerk. I know, Jesus. These people don't get it. But anyway, so he sees Rachel, and he's really attracted to her. He says, what do I have to do to win Rachel? Laban says, you know what, Jacob? Come and work for me for 7 years. Which, by the way, these millennial folks these days, they can't hold a job for a whole year. How are they supposed to work 7? Right? They get bored. But not for a girl, God. Humans do crazy things for girls, believe me. Oh yeah, Jesus, I guess you know them better. Anyway, so he works for Laban, doesn't get Rachel, ends up with Leah. What the heck? Later ends up with Rachel. Great. He worked 14 years for Laban, built up a bunch of sheep, and then, being the heel grabber that he is, he stole all the sheep. So he's running, and he's looking out for Laban, and Laban's like, Jacob, give me back my stuff and all of my gods. And he's like, I didn't take your gods. Little does he know, Rachel stole the gods. So Rachel has all the gods, he has all the sheep, and Laban's like, you know what? Let's just draw a line in the sand. And that line in the sand is still there. That separates those who descended from Ham and those who descended from Shem. The Canaanites and the Hebrews, and this rivalry starts to build. And Jacob says, great, have your line in the sand. And a servant comes and says, your brother Esau's looking for you. And he goes, oh, great, Laban's trying to kill me, now Esau's trying to kill me. I'm going to go out into the wilderness. And while he was on the way to Paran-Aram, he had this crazy dream where these angels were ascending and descending in this place called, he was there, and he was like, man, God is here. And Jacob and I, that was the first kind of alone time we'd had on this road trip for a while. And so he set up a statue there, and he called it Bethel. God is in this place. And he recognized that I was there with him. And it was like we really connected. And he goes back to Bethel after his 14 years, and he's sitting there stewing. He's wondering, he's trying to figure out what he's going to say to his brother, like, sorry I stole your legacy. I don't know what's going to happen to your future. Please don't kill me. And so he's trying to parse this out, and then I was getting kind of frustrated with his sort of melancholy attitude, so we start wrestling. And he gets me in a headlock, and he says, give me a blessing. And I said, I gave you a blessing. I've been giving you a blessing for generations. He says, give me a better blessing. And I say, okay, fine. I'll call you Israel, because you struggle. I used to think you were kind of a heel grabber, kind of like just manipulative, but you've really proven to me that you strive with God. You're somebody who's willing to be in this struggle and be on this road trip with me. And so I named him Israel. And he goes, great. Is that going to be like a nation? I say, absolutely it is. It's going to be the best nation, lots of fruitful, multiplicitous blessings. And so he goes, great. Well, then Esau shows up, and he's like, oh, my goodness, Esau's going to kill me. And Esau says, Jacob, how was your trip? I haven't seen you forever. And Jacob's like, this is great. This is nice. And Esau's like, come with me into my land. And I'm like, no, I'm just going to stay back here in Canaan. You go on ahead. I'll catch up when the women and goats and everything catch up. So Esau goes on ahead. Jacob kind of stays there. And then Jacob kind of stalls out for a little bit, and he hangs out in Canaan. God, this is quite a trip. Seems like you've been kind of through the ringer with these people. I know, right? They're crazy, but I love them. They've been a lot of fun to work with and kind of move through. So, I mean, Isaac was different than Jacob, and Abraham was different than Isaac, and it was this great journey. So what happens next? Is there you're probably getting pretty close to home. Yeah, I am getting close to where we are. So Jacob has a bunch of sons with Leah, which is the girl he was not all that into, if you remember. So Leah keeps having all of these sons, and Jacob's like, just don't really like these kids as much. And then, because surprise, surprise, Rachel is barren, what is up with the water in this part of the world? All these women are barren. And so Rachel starts praying, and I go, you know what? Let's open the womb here. And a son is born to Rachel named Joseph. And then another son named Benjamin. And Jacob's like, oh my gosh, I have 14 kids. I can't handle this. He actually has 12, and 10 of them are from Leah. And so Leah and Rachel and Isaac all die, and they put them in this cave in Machpelah. Okay, so keep in mind, Jacob's been on this move away from Esau, this move away from Laban, this move with God. And he finally gets with me, and we decide, okay, we're going to stay in Canaan, where you've been with Machpelah, this place that Abraham kind of grew up. And Jacob's kind of beside himself. Now he's a single parent to 12 kids, and they're all boys. What am I supposed to do here? How am I supposed to treat these kids all equally? Surprise, he doesn't. He loves Joseph more than the other boys because they're Rachel's, and he loved Rachel, and Rachel's dead, and Leah's still around, and he's like, well, you are my love's continuance, so here's a nice coat. Joseph puts on his fancy coat. It's got either long sleeves or many colors. Nobody really knows. I kind of like the Technicolor Dreamcoat idea. That's pretty cool. So Joseph's walking around in this fancy coat, and his brothers are like, you think you're fancy? And he's like, guess what? I had a dream that you're all bowing down to me as sheaves of wheat. And they're like, who are you? Why would you even say that to us? And Jacob's like, son, don't aggravate your brothers. And he's like, Daddy, but I had another dream. I had a dream that the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And Jacob's like, who are you, kid? You think that me and your wife and all of your brothers are going to be bowing down to you? And Joseph goes, yep, that's exactly what the dream seems to say. And the brothers get pretty upset, rightfully so, because they would be jealous, as I would. And then Jacob stores those things up in his heart. He ponders them. He says, we'll see what happens here. Well, that brings us to this part. Joseph goes out to his brothers. They're in the field. The brothers beat him up. They sell him to some Ishmaelites. Ishmael was Abraham's other son. So he gets bought by Ishmaelites and sent to Egypt, and he works in somebody's house. Joseph, meanwhile, his coat has been torn to shreds and covered in blood, and Jacob starts crying, and he's like, Joseph's dead. I guess I'll leave this land to Reuben, I guess. And Reuben and the other brothers are like, let's fight about this. And then there's this aside with one of their stepsisters, Tamar, and all of this starts to grow, and they're building nations, and they're becoming warriors, all of these 11 tribes, Dan and Benjamin and Naphtali, and all of them are fighting for each other and vying for their father's blessing because it really belongs to Joseph. And Joseph was a good kid, Jesus. I really liked him. Sounds kind of arrogant. No, he was a nice kid. He just had a vivid imagination. So here's what happens. He goes to jail in Egypt. He goes to work for this man named Potiphar in Egypt. And Potiphar's like, this kid's got promise because I was with him and I was making things good for him because this kid just can't seem to stay out of trouble. Well, he reaches this pinnacle of success at Potiphar's estate, and his wife says, hey, Joseph, come lay with me. And he's like, no thanks. That's totally inappropriate. She's like, come on, lie with me. And he's like, I'm not going to lie with you. Like, be subtle, please, geez. And so she grabs his cloak, and his clothes just rip off, like he must have been wearing one of those tearaway suits or something. And he runs outside, and she's like, that guy tried to sleep with me. And Joseph's like, no, I didn't. And Potiphar tackles him and puts him in jail. I don't know, that probably didn't actually happen, but something like that. Sends him to jail, and the jail keeper goes, wait, aren't you that boy that worked for Potiphar? And he's like, yeah, this is all, like, I shouldn't be here, but he's like, hey, that's fine with me. You were really good for Potiphar. Can you do stuff around the jail so I can, like, sleep in my quarters? He's like, yeah, totally. Jail keeper's like, great. So Joseph takes over the jail. And then there are these two guys in jail, and they're like, man, I had this crazy dream. What was it about? I don't know. I can't even tell. Maybe there's somebody who can interpret dreams. And Joseph is like, I can interpret dreams. And he says, tell me about it. And he goes, well, it's not really me, but it's God, the God of Abraham. That's my God, and that's the one who interprets your dreams. And they go, okay, great. The cupbearer was working for Pharaoh, and the baker was also working for Pharaoh. And the cupbearer says, well, I had this dream that there were 3 grapes, and they dropped into the cups, and I gave one to Pharaoh. He's like, that means you'll get your job back. And the baker's like, Joseph, that's great news. I had a dream that I had 3 baskets on my head full of bread. He goes, oh, what happened with the bread? Birds were eating it. He goes, oh, I'm sorry, man, but that means that Pharaoh's going to hang you. And so these two are like, okay, whatever. And the cupbearer's like, hey, if I get that promotion, I'm going to remember you, and I'm going to bring you out of jail. And he gets promoted. Baker gets killed. He forgets about Joseph. Joseph's still in the cell, and he's like, oh, well, at least I got the dreams right. A few years later, Pharaoh's having troubling dreams, and he goes, can somebody interpret dreams? And the cupbearer's like, I forgot about that kid. Pharaoh, I do know somebody who can interpret some dreams. He goes, bring him to me. I need to know what's going on. I've got fat cows eating skinny cows, and skinny cows eating fat cows, and grain eating grain. I don't know what's going on. And so he brings him up, and he says, okay, son, I heard you can interpret dreams. Here's what's going on. There are 7 skinny cows that just come out of the Nile and eat all these 7 fat cows. And then there's these 7 plump heads of grain that eat these 7 skinny heads of grain that eat this plump grain. And I don't know what to make of it. And he's like, oh, that's pretty easy. It's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, save for 7 years, give it to the famine years. And Pharaoh goes, oh, are you sure? And he goes, well, I mean, that's just what God is saying. And Pharaoh goes, finally, somebody making some sense. Give this boy a gold chain. So he throws a gold chain around his neck, and he says, you will be basically like me because you're like a god. He goes, I'm not a god. I'm just hearing from God and doing God things. And so Joseph ends up in this really powerful position, and he's managing this next 7 years of plenty to save up for those 7 years of famine. Right? So Pharaoh's in this great position where he's got this incredible guy taking care of the land of Egypt and amassing more land and food and livestock. And Joseph is in this really good position where he's the most powerful man in Egypt. Enter his brothers. They come up in these years of famine, and they say, hey, Joseph, can you give us some food? And he says, yes, I can give you some food. But I need to know what happened to your youngest brother. And they said, we left him at home because our dad doesn't want him to come, their brother Benjamin, because Jacob doesn't want him to die like Joseph did. And Joseph, knowing this, plays a little game with them and puts a cup in their bag and says, one of you stole from me, and he puts them in jail. And then they have to go back to Jacob, and they're like, we have to bring Benjamin. And he's like, not Benjamin, I lost Joseph too. So they send Benjamin, and then he convinces them all to come up to Egypt. And when they're up in Egypt, he reveals himself to his brothers and says, I am your brother Joseph. And they go, you're Joseph? You're speaking Egyptian. He goes, yeah, I know, I learned it. It's pretty cool. They're like, that's great, I guess. We're going to lose our birthright. And Jacob comes up, and he's like, oh, my son Joseph, you're actually alive. Good, I can die now. And Pharaoh brings him in and says, Jacob, how's your life been? And Jacob says, well, it's been really hard. There's been a lot of struggle. Lost my wife. I've been raising 12 kids out in the desert. Don't have a lot of food. My brother wanted to kill me. My uncle wanted to kill me. Not great, but I'm glad that Joseph's doing well, and thank you for letting us live here. And Pharaoh says, that's a sad story, but good thing Joseph's here. And then Joseph's brothers come up and say, hey, Joseph, we're sorry about the whole lion eating you thing, selling you to Ishmaelites and getting you in Egypt. And he's like, you know what, brothers? It's okay. It's all good, because what you intended for harm, God used for good. And he worked with me through this trip. And then Joseph dies. And he leaves his brother's children in care of Egypt. And the Israelites find themselves in Egypt with God's blessing through Joseph, who says, don't worry, everything will be fine. Pharaoh respects and loves me. He will care for you. And we will be a great nation. Funny thing that happened right before this. Joseph calls in Jacob before he's about to die, and he says, Jacob, will you bless my sons? And Jacob goes, blessings on you, boys. And he says, Dad, you got your hands backwards. The older one is over here. You should put your right hand on him and give him the better blessing. And he's like, look, this worked out pretty well for my brother and I, so I'm going to do it for your sons. So Ephraim grows up and becomes the stronger king. But this blessing, it goes down through the ages. And the blessing is continual. And the thing is, from Abraham to Joseph, what they eventually learn is that I'm there with them on this trip. I've been with them, blessing them, working with them in their various weaknesses and fallbacks and drawbacks. Whoa. That's quite a story to live into, Dad. I don't know what I should do. Jesus, you'll be fine. Just be me. It'll be good. So, now imagine this. God's had this time to process this road trip with his son. He's had this time to figure out sort of what's going on. And we see this character of God drawn across the story of these major patriarchs. They're all stories of love and blessing, preservation, in various regards. Despite Jacob's lying and manipulation, Isaac's feebleness, Abraham's ethnic cleansings, Isaac's slight racism, his demand that his sons marry somebody else outside of Canaan, God works through it and preserves the blessing into Egypt, into a new land. And he makes those generations multiply. So imagine this. God goes into work, and he has to tell this story, the 1-minute version, not the 20 or 30-minute version. And he shows up. Elijah! God! Hey! Good to see you. I'm glad you're back at work. I was running out of things to say to people. Yeah, okay, well, I'm glad that you'll be prophesying for me for a while. Yeah, it's a nice job. I like it. Anyway, how was the trip? What was it like? Oh, it was great. Here's kind of my rundown. Let's go to the next slide here. It was crazy. Basically, I traveled back and forth with this stubborn, womanizing pagan named Abram. Built a homestead with a blind, gullible racist whose dad tried to kill him. Spent years with a slimy, manipulative little man trying to earn his dad's favor, Jacob, and kept working with this kid who couldn't seem to stay out of trouble to build a great empire. But pretty soon, I'm going to have to go back there and get him out of Egypt. Overall, it was a pretty good trip. I think that the first sort of generation of people that we walk with God, we see this thing happen. God, in all the imperfections of humanity, steps into our story with us, and he's inviting us to step onto this trip with him. And the great thing about this is that this is a story that we can step into at any point. We can step into the story of blessing and favor, the story that speaks to any life circumstance. All of the life circumstances of today are seen in these same things. Infighting in the family, troubles with money, troubles over whether you have too many kids and it's driving you crazy, or you and your spouse are trying so hard to have a kid and you can't. No matter what the circumstance, God is with you in this trip. He's been with humanity throughout this entire trip, working in all of those circumstances. Violence, hardship, poverty, movement. It's all God working to bring his blessing in our lives. And I would encourage you, as we pray today, and we're going to be doing this more consistently at Pacific Keep. If you want to start that journey, now is a good time. There's no wrong time to start a journey with God, to step into that road trip with him. And if you want to do that, please speak with one of us about it, what it would be like to jump into this road trip. What would it be like to step into this grand story? What would it be like to move my life forward with God? So let us pray. Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity that you've given us to step into your story. Thank you for the story you've been writing from the beginning of humanity. Thank you for allowing us to intersect with your story and your character. Thank you for your blessing. May we feel it in our lives, no matter what the circumstances, that you are still calling us into a good and beautiful vision for what life can be. Amen. Go in peace. Have a great week, everybody.